300 warriors bowed, their heads held high against soldiers and settlers, now lowered in reverence. They were honoring a 9-year-old girl, an orphan whose dress was a patchwork of rags and whose face was smudged with the grime of a life lived in the shadows. These men, who had met rifles without flinching, were now paying tribute to a child who had never known a moment of kindness. How does a stray from a town that despised her earn the respect of a people who had every reason to hate her kind? The answer is not found in this moment of impossible honor. It begins, as so many things do in this hard land, with cold, hunger, and a desperate flight into the wilderness. It begins just one day prior. The world came to Abigail first as a chill. It was a deep, honest cold that lived in the packed earth floor of the livery stable and crept up through the loose hay she called a bed. It was the first thing she knew of the morning. Long before the sun had risen, she would lie still, curled into a tight knot, and listen to the world wake up around her. It was a language of soft, shuffling sounds, the gentle stamp of a hoof, the sleepy snort of a draft horse, the rustle of mice in the walls. These were the sounds of living things, and in the dark they were her only company. Gravelbone, the town that grudgingly hosted her existence, was built on a foundation of grit and fear. It was a place where hope came to die, leaving behind a skeleton of peeling clapboard and soured dreams. The main street was a river of mud in the spring and a desert of dust in the summer, flanked by buildings that leaned on each other like weary drunks. To the men and women of Gravelbone, survival was a grim transaction made with the land, and there was no room in their ledgers for a 9-year-old orphan. Abigail was not a child to them. She was a stray, a piece of leftover sorrow from the fever that had swept through 2 winters past, a constant quiet reminder of their own fragility. She learned to move like a wisp of smoke, an unseen figure in the periphery. Her presence was an exercise in near invisibility. She knew the precise moment the stable hand, a sour old man named Jeb, would spit his wad of tobacco before starting his rounds. That was her cue to slip out from the hayloft, a fleeting shadow against the rough-hewn wood, and melt into the gray pre-dawn light. She was small for her age, a bundle of sharp angles held together by a faded calico dress, so patched it was more a map of past misfortunes than a piece of clothing. Her hair, the color of sun-bleached straw, was a tangled mess, and her face was perpetually smudged with the dirt of her station. But her eyes, the color of a stormy sky, missed nothing. Her first stop was always the back alley behind the saloon. It was a foul-smelling canyon of discarded crates and shattered bottles, but it was also a place of desperate opportunity. Here, the saloon cook, a large, sweaty man with a surprising flicker of pity in his eyes, would sometimes leave a bucket of scraps. It was a treasure hunt where the prize might be a heel of stale bread, a few shriveled potatoes, or the gristly end of a steak. Most days, however, she found only coffee grounds and eggshells. On this morning, the bucket was empty, scraped clean, her stomach, a tight, familiar knot of hunger, clenched in protest. She continued her silent patrol down the main street. Gravelbone was stirring now. Mr. Henderson, the storekeeper, was sweeping the boardwalk in front of his mercantile with short, angry strokes of his broom, his lips a thin, disapproving line. He was a man who weighed his thumb along with the flour, a fact everyone knew but no one challenged. When his gaze flickered over Abigail, it was with the same irritation he'd show a stray dog nosing at his trash. He didn't speak, didn't have to. His eyes said, "Vermin." Further down, the rhythmic clang of a hammer on steel announced that Miller, the blacksmith, was already at his forge. He was a mountain of a man, his face perpetually hidden behind a beard thick with soot. His fear of the world outside Gravelbone was the loudest in town. He spoke often, and with great authority, about the savagery of the Wyokena. He told tales of raids and scalped children, his voice a low growl that made other men nod and grip their rifles tighter. Abigail had heard the stories. She'd seen the fear in their eyes, a fever that burned hotter than any sickness. To them, the vast, whispering wilderness that surrounded their tiny bastion of civilization was not a place of beauty, but a place of monsters. Abigail knew the wilderness differently. She had never seen a monster in the trees. The only ones she knew lived in town. A tantalizing smell drifted from the bakery, the warm, yeasty scent of fresh bread. Mrs. Gable, the baker's wife, was known for her piety and her stinginess. She left her day-old bread on a back shelf, but not for charity. She sold it for a penny a loaf, a price as far out of Abigail's reach as the moon. Still, Hope was a stubborn weed. Abigail crept around to the back, her eyes scanning the ground near the flour barrels. Sometimes a crust or a dropped roll would be waiting. Today there was nothing. A shutter opened above her, and Mrs. Gable's sharp face appeared. "Get on, you little rat," she hissed, her voice like scraping stones. "Go haunt someone else's property." Abigail didn't need to be told twice. She scurried away. The woman's scorn a physical blow. Words like rat and vermin were the only names she ever heard. She was beginning to believe them. She found a spot across the street, hidden in the narrow gap between the land office and the assay house, and watched the town come fully to life. She saw families, mothers in bonnets, holding the hands of scrubbed clean children, fathers discussing the price of feed. They moved within a bubble of belonging that was as invisible and impenetrable to her as glass. They had homes to return to, meals waiting on tables, beds to sleep in. They had names that were spoken with affection. The sight of it all created a hollow ache in her chest, a longing so vast and deep it felt like a part of her own anatomy. Her gaze drifted past the edge of town, to where the dusty street dissolved into the open plain, and beyond that to the dark, hazy silhouette of the Pahazizi, the Yellow Hills. The settlers called them the Black Hills, a name that spoke of their fear. But Abigail had once heard a traveling trapper, a man with a kinder face than most, use the old name. He'd said it was what the Wyokina called them, the Yellow Hills. It sounded like a place of light. To her, the hills were a sanctuary. They were the only place that didn't judge her. The trees didn't care if her dress was patched or her face was dirty. The birds didn't fall silent when she approached. The wind didn't whisper insults. In the deep, pine-scented quiet of the forest, she could pretend she wasn't an orphan, but an explorer. She wasn't scavenging for food, but foraging for rare specimens. She wasn't alone, but simply quiet, waiting for her family to call her home for supper. The ache in her chest sharpened. It was time to go. The town had offered her nothing but its usual contempt, and the gnawing in her belly was becoming a roar. There were berries in the hills, and if she was lucky, she might find a patch of wild onions. Slipping from her hiding spot, she moved along the backs of the buildings, using the clutter of frontier life as her cover. She passed stacked lumber, rusting farm equipment, and piles of discarded junk that represented the failed dreams of those who had come before. Finally, she was at the edge of town. Behind her lay the rigid, suffocating grid of Gravelbone, a place of straight lines and hard rules. Ahead of her lay the forest, a place of wild, untamed life. She stepped from the dusty road onto the soft bed of pine needles, and the world changed. The air grew cooler, cleaner. The harsh, unforgiving sunlight of the plains was filtered through a high canopy of green, dappling the forest floor in shifting patterns of light and shadow. The sounds of the town, the hammering, the shouting, the creak of wagon wheels faded, replaced by a symphony of natural sounds. The whisper of wind through the ponderosa pines sounded like a great sleeping breath. A blue jay screeched a warning from a high branch. A squirrel chittered angrily before darting up a tree trunk. Abigail's shoulders, always hunched in a posture of tense defensiveness, began to relax. Her steps became lighter. Here, she was not a stray. She was a creature of the woods, as much a part of it as the deer and the rabbits. She moved with a practiced silence, her bare feet finding purchase on rocks and roots without a sound. This was her true home, the only place that had ever welcomed her. She walked deeper, following a barely there game trail, the familiar scent of pine and damp earth filling her lungs. She felt a sense of peace settle over her, a quiet joy that was as precious and rare as a gold nugget. The hunger in her stomach was still there, a dull ache, but out here it seemed less important. Out here she felt full of something else. For now it was enough. The accusation that finally drove her from Gravelbone was as swift and baseless as a flash flood. Miller, the blacksmith, had left a small greasy sack of salted pork hanging from a hook just inside his smithy. The door left open to catch the morning breeze. Abigail, drawn by the savory, forbidden scent, had paused in the alley across the street, her stomach aching with a hollow, desperate need. She had done nothing more than watch, her feet rooted to the spot, but when Miller emerged, wiping soot from his hands, his eyes immediately found her. His gaze, clouded with suspicion, flicked from her to the sack and back again. He saw not a hungry child, but a thief in waiting, a vermin drawn to what was his. "Get away from there," he bellowed, his voice a great crashing wave of sound that made her flinch. He took a heavy step toward her, his face a thundercloud of accusation. "Don't you even think about it, you little sneak." She didn't need to be told. Fear, sharp and cold, shot through her. She turned and fled. She didn't just run from the blacksmith's rage, she ran from the weight of every scornful look, every hissed insult, every door that had ever been shut in her face. She ran from the suffocating judgment of Gravelbone itself, her bare feet slapped against the packed dirt of the main street, kicking up little puffs of dust. She didn't look back, but she could feel the town's collective glare on her, a physical force pushing her away, casting her out. Her flight didn't end at the edge of town. It carried her deep into the sanctuary of the Pahazizi. She ran with the heedless energy of a startled deer, pushing past the familiar outer ring of trees and into the deeper, wilder heart of the woods. The air grew cooler, thick with the scent of pine sap and damp earth. Sunlight struggled to pierce the dense canopy, and the forest floor was a soft, forgiving carpet of fallen needles. She ran until the fire in her lungs burned hotter than the shame in her heart, until her legs felt like lead, and her breath came in ragged, tearing gasps. Finally, she collapsed in a small, sun-dappled clearing she had never seen before. It was a pocket of perfect tranquility. A narrow stream, clear as glass, gurgled over a bed of smooth gray stones, its music a gentle counterpoint to the whisper of the wind in the high branches. A thick patch of ferns grew near the water, their fronds a vibrant, almost electric green. For a long time she just lay there, her small chest heaving, letting the peace of the place seep into her bones, washing away the grime of the town. The world for a moment was perfect. And then she saw it. At first it was just a splash of unnatural color against the green of the ferns, a patch of deep, dark crimson. Then her eyes traced the source. A man lay sprawled on the ground, his body contorted at an unnatural angle. He was a Wyokaina warrior, powerfully built, his bare torso and arms a canvas of faint, silvery scars that spoke of a life lived on the edge of danger. His face, smeared with the faded ochre and black of a hunt, was etched with a deep, unconscious agony. But it was his leg that held her gaze, that made a cold knot of dread form in her stomach. It was trapped, held fast in the cruel, rusted teeth of a bear trap. The iron jaw, a brutal piece of settler machinery, had bitten deep into his flesh. The metal was dark and stained, not just with rust, but with the warrior's lifeblood, which had soaked the ground around it, turning the delicate ferns a sickening dark red. The chain attached to the trap was bolted to a thick pine root, ensuring there was no escape. Abigail froze, her breath catching in her throat. Every story Miller had ever told, every whispered warning about the bloodthirsty savages who roamed these hills, came roaring back. This was the monster from the tales, the reason men in Gravelbone kept their rifles loaded and their doors barred. Her every instinct, honed by a life of avoiding trouble, she should go back to town, tell the sheriff, and let the men handle it. They would see it as a victory, a threat neutralized. But she couldn't move. The stories were just words, just noises made by fearful men. This was real. The man's chest rose and fell in shallow, ragged breaths. A low groan escaped his lips, a sound of pure, unadulterated pain that cut through the forest's quiet. It was not the sound of a monster. It was the sound of a living thing suffering. She took a hesitant step closer. The flies were already beginning to gather, buzzing in a frantic, greedy cloud around the wound. The smell of blood was heavy in the air, coppery and raw. He was bigger than any man in town, his muscles coiled and powerful even in his unconscious state. He wore simple buckskin leggings and moccasins, one of which had been torn away by the trap's brutal closure. His black hair was long and loose, and tangled in it was a single hawk feather. Her eyes were drawn back to the trap. It was a hateful thing, a mechanical predator lying in wait. Its rust-pitted surface seemed to sneer, its jagged teeth a perfect symbol of the cold, indiscriminate cruelty of the world she knew. It didn't care who it caught. It only knew how to bite, how to hold, how to break. It was a piece of Gravelbone's own mean spirit, left here in this sacred, peaceful place. And seeing its brutal handiwork, something inside Abigail shifted. The fear didn't vanish, but it was pushed aside by a wave of something else. Something fierce and protective. It was a hot, righteous anger. This was wrong. Slowly, cautiously, she crept to the warrior's side. She was so small next to him, a sparrow next to a hawk. She reached out a trembling hand and touched his forehead. His skin was scorching hot, dry as dust, fever. The wound was poisoned, the iron jaw seeping its filth into his body. He moaned again at her touch, his eyelids fluttering weakly. For a terrifying second, his dark eyes opened. They were glazed with pain and confusion, but they found her. They saw her. In that moment, the world held its breath. The 9-year-old orphan and the wounded warrior stared at each other across a gulf of hatred and fear that had been dug by generations. She expected him to shout, to curse, to try and lunge for her. He was, after all, the enemy. He did none of those things. His gaze held on her for a long moment, a flicker of disbelief in their depths. Then his eyes slid closed again, his body slumping back into the grip of unconsciousness. The connection, however brief, was made. The monster was gone. In its place was just a man who was dying alone in the woods, and Abigail, who knew what it was to be alone, could not walk away. Her gaze fell upon a small object hanging from a leather thong around his neck. It was a turtle, intricately beaded onto a piece of hide. The beads were tiny, in shades of sky blue and earthy brown, sewn with a careful, loving hand. It was a beautiful thing, a piece of a world she couldn't imagine. The turtle, she knew from watching them by the creek, was a creature of patience, of resilience, a creature that carried its home on its back. She reached out and, with a fingertip, lightly touched the smooth, cool beads. In the face of all this brutality, the trap, the wound, the hatred, this small turtle felt like a promise. It spoke of a life beyond this moment of agony. It spoke of family, of a daughter or a wife who had stitched these beads with love. It spoke of a home. And in that instant, Abigail made a choice. It wasn't a choice she thought about. It was a choice her heart made for her. She was not a settler. He was not a savage. They were just two living things in a clearing, and one of them needed help. The work of her small hands was about to begin. The sun, a merciless white eye in the vast blue sky, beat down on the small clearing, and the heat began to bake the earth. The warrior, Mako, was burning from the inside out. Abigail could feel the fever radiating from him, a dangerous, dry heat that felt like it was consuming him. She knew, with the simple, unclouded certainty of a child who had watched sickness take her own parents, that the fever was a worse enemy than the trap itself. It was a silent fire that would cook a man's senses and boil the life from his blood. Her mind, usually a whirlwind of fear and hunger, became preternaturally calm. There was no room for panic. There was only the problem and the work. Water was the first and most important thing. She cupped her small hands, the fingers laced tight, and scooped a precious mouthful from the stream. It was a frustratingly inefficient process. More water trickled through her fingers than ever made it to his lips, but she was persistent. Trip after trip she made, a tiny, determined figure scurrying between the stream and the dying man. She dribbled the cool liquid onto his cracked lips, watching his throat work with a dry, reflexive swallow. His skin was so hot that the water seemed to sizzle and evaporate the moment it touched him. She remembered watching her mother press a cool cloth to her father's head. When the fever took hold, she had no cloth, save for the ragged hem of her dress, and she would need that. Instead, she looked to the stream bank. There, in the cool, shady earth, was a thick patch of dark, rich mud. Without hesitation, she scooped up handfuls of it. It was cool and slick in her palms. Gently, she began to spread it over his forehead and chest. It was a desperate, childlike remedy, but it was something. It was an act of defiance against the fire that was consuming him. The iron jaw of the trap was a malevolent presence. She knew she couldn't open it. She lacked the strength and the knowledge, but she couldn't leave it. The metal, heated by the sun, was likely searing his flesh. She gathered broad leaves from a nearby bush and carefully packed them between the cold iron and his hot skin, a flimsy but necessary barrier. The wound itself was a horrifying sight, a mangled mess of flesh and blood. She cleaned it as best she could with water from the stream, her touch surprisingly gentle. Then, remembering the thick moss she had seen growing on the north side of the pines, she gathered clumps of it. It was soft and absorbent. Carefully she packed it into the wound, creating a crude but effective compress to stem the bleeding. Sometime in the haze of the afternoon, he woke. His world was a swimming nightmare of pain and heat. The sun was a hammer, and every beat of his heart was a spike being driven into his leg. He tried to move, but his body was a leaden weight, and the fire in his limb flared into an inferno that stole his breath. He was aware, dimly, of a presence. A spirit, perhaps. A small, pale thing that moved with a quiet, rustling sound. He managed to force his heavy eyelids open, and the world swam into a blurry focus. It was not a spirit. It was a child. A white child. The sight was so fundamentally wrong, so profoundly impossible, that his fever-addled brain couldn't process it. She was the daughter of his enemies, the pale-skinned people who stole the land, who killed the buffalo, whose traps lay waiting in the sacred hills to maim and kill. Their scent was one of iron and smoke and wrongness. She should be running from him. She should be screaming. Or more likely, she should be standing over him with a rock in her hand, ready to finish the work their trap had started. Instead, she was kneeling beside him, her small face a mask of intense concentration. Her hands, caked in mud, were working on him. He felt the impossible coolness of the mud on his burning skin. He saw the makeshift bandage of green moss packed against his wound. He saw her, a tiny waif in a dress of rags, and he was consumed by a wave of delirious confusion. Was this a trick? A new kind of white man's cruelty? To offer a glimmer of hope before the final darkness? He tried to speak, to snarl a curse at her in his own tongue. But his throat was a desert. Only a dry, rasping croak emerged. The child froze, her stormy gray eyes widening with fear. He saw the terror in them, and it was a familiar sight. It was the look all her kind had when they saw a red man. But there was something else there too. Not hatred, not malice. It was pity. He watched as she scurried back to the stream and returned with more water. He felt the cool trickle on his lips, and his body, despite his mind's screaming protests, accepted the offering. His gaze fell upon the turtle amulet at his neck. It had been a gift from his wife, a prayer for a safe hunt, for a swift return. He saw the child's finger, smudged with his own blood and her mud, lightly touch it. The contact was brief, but it was grounding. A spirit would not have weight. A trick would not be so gentle. He was Mako, a warrior of the Wyokuna. He had fought settlers and soldiers. He had seen their brutality and their treachery. He knew them, but he did not know this. He did not understand the quiet, determined work of these small hands. As the fever pulled him back under, his last conscious thought was a single searing question that burned hotter than his poisoned blood. Why? The sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. The day's heat gave way to the evening's chill. Abigail, exhausted and hollow with hunger, did not leave. She built a small, crude shelter of pine boughs over him to ward off the worst of the dew. She huddled beside him, a small, shivering ball of determination, listening to his ragged breathing in the growing dark. The forest, once a sanctuary, now felt vast and threatening. The snap of a twig made her jump. The hoot of an owl sounded like a mournful cry. She was alone, in the deep woods, with a wounded man her people considered a monster. She was terrified. But the thought of leaving him, of abandoning him to the cold and the dark and the predators that roamed the night, was even more terrifying. His pain was a tangible thing, a presence in the clearing, as real as the trees and the stones, and in his suffering, she saw a faint, terrible echo of her own. He was alone. She was alone. And in this small, bloody clearing, that shared loneliness was a bond stronger than fear, stronger than hatred, stronger than a history of bloodshed she was too young to understand. She stayed. Dawn arrived not as a gentle warmth but as a slow, gray dilution of the night. It brought a damp, bone-aching chill that the thin fabric of Abigail's dress could not repel. She had drifted in and out of a shallow, fitful sleep, her body curled into a tight ball beside the still form of the warrior. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves had sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through her. She was a sentry on a desperate watch, fueled by nothing but fear and a stubborn, inexplicable sense of duty. The warrior, Mako, was still alive. His breathing was a faint, shallow whisper in the quiet of the morning. But it was there. The fire of his fever had not broken, and his skin was still terrifyingly hot to the touch. But the mud she had plastered on him had dried into a cracked gray mask that seemed to have drawn some of the heat away. The moss on his wound was dark and saturated, but the bleeding had slowed to a sluggish ooze. It was a fragile, tenuous hold on life, a single flickering candle in a vast, dark room, and Abigail guarded it with everything she had. She was scooping more water from the stream, her movements slow and stiff with exhaustion, when the world changed. It happened without a sound. One moment, the clearing was empty, a secluded sanctuary holding only her and the dying man. The next, they were surrounded. They did not march or stride into the clearing. They simply appeared, emerging from the spaces between the trees as if they were spirits of the forest, given form. One stood by the large pine, another by the granite outcrop, a third by the stream bank. More and more of them materialized from the dappled shadows until a complete, unbroken circle of men surrounded the clearing. They were a wall of silent, intimidating presence, their figures clad in worn buckskin and leather, their faces grim and unreadable. Abigail stood frozen, a pathetic drip of water falling from her cupped hands. Her heart, which had been a slow, tired drum, suddenly began to hammer against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. These were the men from the stories. They were tall and lean, their bodies sinewy and hard, their dark hair braided and hanging down their backs. Their faces were not masks of monstrous paint, but maps of a harsh, weary existence, etched with the lines of sun and wind and sorrow. Scars, thin and white, marked the skin of their arms and chests. They carried pragmatic, deadly weapons, long knives sheathed at their belts, powerful bows, and one man held an old, long-barreled rifle, its stock worn smooth with use. Their eyes, dark and sharp as obsidian flakes, took in the scene with a swift, predatory assessment. They saw their fallen brother. They saw the hated iron jaw of the settler's trap clamped onto his leg. And then, they saw her. The collective weight of their gaze was a physical force, pressing down on her, stealing the air from her lungs. The silence stretched, taut and thin, threatening to snap. A younger warrior, his face a mask of rage and grief, took a step forward, his hand dropping to the handle of his knife. A low, guttural word escaped his lips, a curse directed at her. He got no further. From the edge of the circle, a larger, older man stepped forward. It was the man Abigail had seen in her vision of the future, the one she would come to know as Chief Hanty. He was taller than the others, his presence carrying an immense, unshakable gravity. His hair was streaked with gray, and the lines on his face were deeper, carved by decades of leadership and loss. He did not speak. He simply lifted his hand, a short, sharp gesture that froze the younger warrior in his tracks. His authority was absolute, his command unquestioned. Chief Hante's eyes, ancient and piercing, swept over the scene. He looked at his son Mako, and a flicker of something, pain, anger, sorrow, passed across his stony features before being locked away again. He looked at the trap, and his lips tightened into a thin, hard line of pure hatred. Finally, his gaze fell upon Abigail. It was not a look of rage, but one of intense, unnerving evaluation. He was not just seeing a white girl. He was reading a story, trying to make sense of a scene that defied all logic and experience. The sound of his people's voices, low and urgent, stirred Mako from his fevered depths. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused and delirious. He saw the familiar faces of his brothers, of his father, and a wave of profound relief washed over him. 8, he rasped, his voice barely audible. Father. He began to speak in the flowing, guttural language of the Wyokina. His words were weak, broken by pained gasps, but they were urgent. As he spoke, the expressions on the warriors' faces began to shift. The raw, murderous hostility softened, replaced by a deep, profound confusion. They looked from their wounded warrior to the tiny, trembling child and back again, their minds struggling to reconcile the impossible story they were hearing. Mako's eyes found Abigail, who was still frozen by the stream. He knew his brothers would not understand. Their hatred for the whites was a deep and well-earned river. He had to make them see. He switched to the clumsy, broken tongue of the settlers, the words costing him a visible effort. No, he breathed, pushing himself up on one elbow. He pointed a trembling finger at Abigail. She helps. White girl. No hurt. She helps. Having delivered his testimony, he collapsed back to the ground, his body surrendering to the fever once more. An even deeper silence fell over the clearing. Mako's words hung in the air, a challenge to everything the warriors knew to be true. White hands did not help. They took, they hurt, They killed. Chief Hante moved to his son's side, kneeling on the blood-soaked earth. With a clinical detachment, he examined the wound, his fingers probing gently around the swollen, discolored flesh. He touched the moss compress, then the dried mud on Mako's forehead. He looked at the flimsy barrier of leaves packed between the iron and the skin. His gaze was that of a man reading tracks in the dirt, deciphering a story told not in words but in deeds. He could see the tracks of a desperate, tireless effort. He could see the work of small hands. He rose slowly, his unreadable eyes once again finding Abigail. She stood utterly still, a lone, pathetic figure against the vast indifference of the forest. Her life hung in the balance of this man's judgment. He had every reason to kill her. Her presence here was a violation. To his people she was a trespasser, the spawn of a people who were systematically destroying their world. To leave her alive was a risk. She could lead soldiers back to their hidden camp. Her death would be a simple, pragmatic act of survival. It would be justice. But the evidence before him told a different story. The hated trap was her people's work, but the life still flickering in his son's body was hers. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, a great, silent mountain of a man weighing the life of one small enemy against a history of endless betrayal. The warriors watched him, their faces tense, waiting for the verdict. Finally, Hante turned his back on Abigail. He issued a series of low, sharp commands in his own language. The warriors, their confusion now replaced by the certainty of their chief's orders, moved with a swift, fluid purpose. One produced a long, flat piece of iron from a leather satchel and began to work on the trap's spring mechanism. Two others began stripping long, sturdy branches from a young pine, lashing them together with leather thongs to create a stretcher. Another knelt by Mako, offering him a drink from a water skin. They worked around Abigail as if she wasn't there, their movements efficient and coordinated. She was utterly invisible to them. The fear that had held her paralyzed began to curdle into a new, terrifying uncertainty. What was her fate? Would they kill her now? Or would they simply leave her here to starve? The sharp, metallic crack of the trap springing open made her jump. The iron jaw released its grip, and two warriors carefully lifted Mako's mangled leg free, placing him gently onto the newly constructed stretcher. Chief Hante gave another command. 4 warriors hoisted the stretcher to their shoulders. Then Hante looked directly at her. He spoke a single guttural word to the young warrior who had first moved toward her with his knife. The warrior nodded and began to walk toward Abigail. This is it, she thought, a wave of cold resignation washing over her. This is the end. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the blow, but it didn't come. Instead, she felt a firm, surprisingly gentle hand on her shoulder. Her eyes snapped open. The young warrior was standing over her, his face no longer filled with rage but with a deep, reluctant curiosity. He did not draw his knife. He simply stood there, his hand on her shoulder, waiting. He gave a slight, insistent tug, urging her to walk. Her fate was not to die here. It was to go with them. As she was led from the clearing, a captive of the very men she had been taught to fear. She didn't know if she had been condemned, or by some impossible miracle, saved. The journey was a long, silent ordeal. Abigail was not bound or dragged, but she was a prisoner nonetheless, enclosed in a moving cage of silent, watchful men. They moved through the forest with a grace that defied their size, their moccasin-clad feet making almost no sound on the forest floor. They were a river of purpose, flowing around obstacles, leaving no wake. Abigail, small and clumsy in comparison, had to half-run to keep up, her bare feet stumbling over roots and stones. The young warrior who had first taken her shoulder stayed near, his presence a constant, intimidating reminder of her captivity. He never spoke to her, but he would occasionally steer her with a firm hand, guiding her over a fallen log or away from a patch of thorns. It was not a kind gesture, but a practical one. She was cargo to be delivered, and they would deliver her intact. Their focus was on their fallen comrade. The 4 warriors carrying the stretcher moved with a steady, practiced rhythm, absorbing the jolts of the uneven terrain to give Mako as smooth a ride as possible. They were a single organism, connected by a shared, unspoken grief and determination. Seeing their profound care for their kinsman, Abigail felt a pang of something she couldn't name. It was a glimpse into a world of belonging, of fierce loyalty, a world she had only ever seen from the outside, through the impenetrable glass of her loneliness. After what felt like hours, they descended into a valley carved by a fast-moving river, and the camp of the Wyokina appeared as if by magic. It was not the chaotic, savage war camp from the blacksmith stories. It was a village, a living, breathing community, nestled in a protective embrace of cottonwood trees. Dozens of hide lodges, some painted with symbols of hunts and visions, were arranged in a great circle. The air was thick with the smell of wood smoke, roasting meat, and the scent of people living their lives. Dogs barked at their approach, and the bright laughing voices of children at play filled the air. And then, everything stopped. The moment they emerged from the tree line with a small, white-faced girl in their midst, a wave of absolute silence washed over the camp. The children's laughter died in their throats. Women looked up from their work, their hands freezing over scraping hides or grinding corn. Men who were mending bows or sharpening knives reached instinctively for their weapons. Every eye, hundreds of them, fixed on Abigail. It was a gaze of pure, unadulterated shock, which quickly curdled into suspicion and open hostility. She was a contamination, a foreign object in the heart of their home, and she could feel their hatred like a physical blow. She was led to the center of the camp, near a large communal fire pit, where the embers of the previous night's fire still glowed. The warriors carrying Mako took him directly to the largest lodge, where two older women, their faces etched with the wisdom of healers, emerged and immediately took charge, shooing the warriors away. The entire camp seemed to hold its breath, waiting. The warriors who had found her formed a loose, intimidating circle around her, separating her from the rest of the tribe. The elders, their faces as weathered as the surrounding hills, emerged from their lodges and came to stand with Chief Hante. This was her trial. There was no courtroom, no judge's bench, just the silent, accusing eyes of an entire people. Chief Hante let the silence stretch, letting the weight of the moment press down. He watched Abigail, who stood trembling, her arms wrapped around herself, a tiny, friendless creature on the verge of collapsing from fear and exhaustion. He saw the terror in her eyes, but beneath it, he saw the same stubborn resilience he had seen in the clearing. Finally, he moved. He walked to where a warrior was holding the rusted bear trap, its iron jaw broken and agape. He took it, the metal heavy in his hand. He held it up for all his people to see, the ugly symbol of the white man's world. Then he walked back to Abigail and dropped it on the ground at her feet with a dull, metallic thud. The sound made her flinch. He did not speak. He didn't need to. He raised a hand and pointed one powerful finger at the trap. Then, he slowly turned his hand and pointed toward the lodge where his son lay, fighting for his life, his eyes, dark and piercing, locked onto hers. The question was there, unspoken but as clear as a thunderclap in the heavy silence. The entire world seemed to shrink to that single, accusing gesture. All the fear, the hunger, the loneliness of her 9 years of life coalesced into a single hard point in her chest. Her throat was tight with unshed tears. She thought of her mother and father, taken by a sickness no one could see. She thought of the faces in Gravelbone twisted with contempt. She thought of the warrior in the clearing, his face a mask of agony. They were all just different kinds of hurt, different kinds of alone. Her voice, when it came, was a tiny, fragile thing, a sparrow's whisper against a wind of hatred. "He looked alone," she said, her voice trembling but clear. She looked up, meeting the chief's gaze. "Like me." A murmur went through the crowd, a rustle of confusion. "When you're alone and hurt, there's nobody," she continued, the words tumbling out now, a simple, painful truth she knew in her bones. I didn't want him to have nobody." The words, so naive, so utterly devoid of the politics of race or war, struck the heart of the Wyokina with the force of a physical blow. They were a people who had been made to feel alone, a tribe pushed to the edges, their world shrinking, their people dying. Every man, woman, and child there understood what it meant to have nobody. Her answer was not a justification, it was a reflection of their own deepest wound, spoken by the child of their enemy. The stony mask on Chief Hante's face finally broke. A profound, weary understanding softened his features. He saw her then, not as a white girl, not as a settler, but as a small, fierce spirit who had looked into the face of his son's suffering and seen her own. She had answered a call of kinship that transcended blood, that transcended tribe. He turned to his people and began to speak in his own tongue. His voice, which had been a low rumble, now rose with a deep, commanding passion. He spoke of the poison of hatred, of the cycle of vengeance that was strangling them all. He spoke of the spirit of this small child who had acted with a pure heart when any warrior would have acted with a blade. He told them that her compassion was a medicine more powerful than any herb, a message from the Great Spirit to remind them of who they were. When he finished, a new kind of silence fell over the camp. It was not the silence of hostility, but of deep contemplative thought. Hante then turned back to Abigail. He knelt before her, so their eyes were level. "Little one," he said, his rough English soft and deliberate, "your people have taken our land. But you have saved our future. You have a warrior's heart." He stood and placed a hand on her head. "You are no longer astray. You are no longer alone. You are Wyokina. We give you a name, Waimiana." He paused, letting the name settle. "Child of the sun, for you have brought light into a dark time." And then, he did the impossible. Chief Hante, leader of the Sun River people, a man who had never lowered his head to any man, bowed. It was a slow, deliberate inclination from the waist, a gesture of profound respect. For a moment no one moved. Then, the young warrior who had captured her, the one who had looked at her with such rage, followed his chief's lead. He too bowed. Another warrior beside him did the same. And then, like a wave spreading through a field of grass, the gesture moved through the crowd. The warriors, the elders, the hunters, man by man, they lowered their heads. 300 men who had been raised on a diet of righteous hatred for her kind were now bowing to her. Abigail stood, frozen, as the last warrior lowered his head. The weight of their respect was more overwhelming than their hatred had been. A single tear traced a clean path through the dirt on her cheek. Then another. They were not tears of fear or sorrow. They were tears of a joy so vast and unfamiliar it felt like her heart would burst. She was no longer a stray, no longer a rat, no longer unseen. She was Waimiana, and for the first time in her life she was home.